Well, it is truly incredible. India is now the world's most populous nation. That's what the United Nations says. And with that come certain statistics and demographics which give us a chance at a future which perhaps generations in this country have not seen. It's called our demographic dividend, and it implies a whole lot of things. But one of the most encouraging aspects of our demographic dividend is that we've got an incredibly young workforce. Approximately 65% of our working age population is of working age, and that means that the opportunities and the potential for the future is absolutely incredible. But of course there are challenges, job creation perhaps the biggest one. To tell us more about that and a lot more, wonderful guest, Dr. Bibek Debroy with us. He's chairperson of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Thanks so very much for being with us. The world's largest population, but also the population with the largest working age. So what does that mean for us in simple terms?
Well, just two words of caution first. That a demographic dividend is not open-ended. It's a bulge in the working age population that happens as part of the process of demographic transition. Today, the rate of population growth is slowing down, so fewer babies are being born. The rate of population growth is down to about 0.8%. And India is going to age beyond about 2035. So this bulge, this demographic dividend, is a window for the next 15 odd years. What do we know from other countries? From other countries we know, particularly from East Asia, that countries which have gone through a process of demographic transition, that process itself leads to a certain increment in GDP growth for various reasons, one of which is of course greater savings, higher income, so on and so forth. So the question to ask is, in the next 15 years, what can we possibly do to tap this demographic dividend? And quickly let me also say that it's not just all India, because India's states differ enormously, they're heterogeneous. In some states like Kerala, the percentage of the old population is already pretty high.
Yeah. In fact, that's an interesting point, because if you do look at the statistics, then of every 100 Indians born presently, the large majority are from North India, and more than 50. And if you look at South India, 5 states combined, it's less than 20. What does that indicate?
The reasons why the rate of population growth slows down is complicated. It depends on female literacy, mothers' literacy, female work participation rates, a whole range of things. The reasons that influence the decline in Kerala are not quite the same as the reasons that influence the decline in Tamil Nadu. But broadly speaking, lower levels of infant mortality, women participating in the workforce, female literacy, mothers as well as the daughters, all of these have a role to play.
The other point that in fact you referred to it is the participation of women in the democracy. To take advantage of the bulge that you have referred to, how important is it for us to enhance the workforce with women in it?
It is, but let me also quickly point out that like many other indicators in an essentially informal and unorganized economy, we don't necessarily measure the contribution of women in the workforce adequately. I'm not talking about issues that are important like women contributing to housework. I'm not talking about that. I'm saying even when women participate in actual economic activities, it's not captured adequately, and which is a point that the last economic survey made, which is the female work participation rate is not 30%. If we actually correct it, it's more like 46%. However, it is a fact that the female work participation rate should be higher, there should be better pay, there should be greater formalization, and greater formalization irrespective of gender is part and parcel of what the government has been trying to do through assorted means.
And I think if you just look at the role of women within the household, and the fact that in our country where women contribute so much to the process of raising families, of keeping a family going, that's not measured, but that is work and that is essential.
I agree, but one must realize there is a problem. The problem is, and this is a problem that's been known since the 1930s, ever since Simon Kuznets started the work of measuring national income, that national income definitionally is the market value of goods and services that are produced. So there definitionally has to be a market. What I am talking about now is quite often because women are not part of the formal labor force. I'm not talking about the domestic work, no doubt that's important, but when women are not part of the formal workforce, when they're part of casual employment, even contractual employment, we probably don't capture it. We don't measure it. So I'm not negating the importance of stepping up. I'm just saying that perhaps it's not as bad as we tend to think it is.
Right. And why is it difficult to reassess these statistics? If you're mentioning 46% is a more real number, in simple terms.
Well, economic survey essentially quoted the ILO or computations done by the ILO. Well, partly it has to do with the question that is asked. Let's understand that this is fundamentally an informal economy. Informal economies with which we often do comparisons, quite often the surveys are enterprise based. And the enterprise tells me who are the employees there. But in India, classically the employer-employee relationship is a very small percentage. That part can only be captured through household surveys, which comes down to the question that do we have refined enough questions in our surveys to capture it? And the bottom line is our questions need to be better.
Right. How do you believe that can be changed in the future going forward? What is the data or the measure that you're looking for to account more adequately for women in the work?
Well, specifically we are talking about one particular question, which most of the time, the most recent survey has been the National Family Health Survey, the 5th version of the National Family Health Survey. And there's been criticism of one particular question which clubs together the productive work and the domestic work. One needs to disentangle the two. So I'm sure when the next round of the survey is done, this will be refined and we'll have a division between them.
Let's talk a little bit about the informal sector, which contributes so much to our economic growth. And yet, again, for example, the ILO says 85% of the non-agricultural workforce in India is informal. I don't know if you necessarily agree with those statistics. But again, measuring India's economic growth by taking into account the informal sector is very important. Number one. Number two, there is the entire issue of giving rights to people in the informal sector, protecting them, ensuring basic incomes. So two aspects of this question, how would you address them?
Two aspects, yes, but there are two different elements in it. The classic definition of informal is that anyone who is outside the purview of the labor legislation, namely the Factories Act. And under the Factories Act, the figure would have been about less than 10% is formal organized. If I look at the total size of the workforce, it's probably somewhere between 450 and 480 million, out of whom half will be in agriculture. The proper organized is just about 30 million. But if I define the organized in terms of the EPFO or availing of benefits, the percentage has been going up. So it's no longer 30 million, it would be something like 50 million. If I'm going to define it in terms of...
The informal workforce would be, in your estimate, 50 million.
The formal
workforce would be 50 million.
People who avail of various benefits. Yes. The process of formalization, you can't make it mandatory, or to a large extent you can't. The reason I said there are two kinds of things. One is the informal individual and the second is the informal enterprise. The two sometimes go hand in hand, but they're not identical. So far as the informal individual is concerned, there is the Shram portal, which is not mandatory, it is voluntary, and increasingly the numbers on the dashboard say that more and more people are getting registered. And this has linked with the Aadhaar card, because many benefits are now linked with Aadhaar. On the informal enterprise, the trouble is MSME requires no mandatory registration. It's a voluntary registration. In some fashion, GST has ensured, and the GSTN number has ensured, that MSME is also getting formalized. So it's a part of a process. It's not something that's going to happen overnight. It's not a binary. So incrementally both are happening.
Right. Let's talk a little bit about, firstly, if you look at where we are now, the fact that we've got a young workforce, the fact, I think that has to do with two important factors: improving healthcare and improving education. Obviously, we need to do a lot more in both. Compared to where we were, and in terms of what these statistics show, India getting out of poverty as we've known it in the past, education and health. Could you quantify those, or could you tell us a little bit about these two factors?
Well, let's take the education one first, because we say education, but what we really mean is skills. And let me state it in the following stark terms. When I'm talking about the workforce, there are people who are part of the workforce and they are not getting jobs. Yeah. And there are people who have opted out of the workforce. The gross enrollment ratio in higher education has been going up. It's probably about 28%. Now, if I look at the young age group, the percentage which is actually looking for jobs is going down. That's the reason for worry. Now, if it is between the ages up to 21 or perhaps even 24, I would say this is because they are enrolling in higher education. This does not explain what is happening to 24 to 39. And here, I think the real problem is the correlation between education and skills, or skills as valued by the market, has broken down, because the education does not lead to marketable skills. So I've invested in the education, and therefore invested not necessarily public expenditure, it can be private expenditure also. Having done that, I expect that the market will pay me 40,000 rupees per month. The market is only prepared to pay me 20,000 rupees per month. And therefore I am voluntarily opting out of the workforce. To my mind, particularly in urban area, less of a problem with rural India, the biggest problem is not that people are not looking for jobs and are not getting jobs, but people voluntarily opting out of the labor force.
In fact, you've written about this. Your exact words in an article for NDTV is that there's a significant gap between the skills imparted in educational institutes in India and the skills required for jobs. Now, we have an entire skill development program in India. What are some of the challenges there?
Oh, the challenges are, the question really to ask is who should deliver these skills? Because if the government delivers the skills, they may or may not be commensurate with whatever the market wants. So ideally, the skills should be delivered by the private sector, where there is a difference between the people who are doing the training and the people who are doing the certification, and there should be a link with the prospective employers. We have talked about PPPs for things like ITIs for a very long time. It's not that there haven't been improvements, but the improvements are very local. We have not been able to scale them up sufficiently. But the answer, I think, is a complicated one, and it would be unreasonable to expect that something that's completely government driven would be able to deliver this.
So then what role would the government have, or should the government have?
In this particular case, the government is more of a facilitator to set up a template with a tripartite kind of involvement with the trainer, the person who's certifying, and the person who is actually doing the placement. The trouble is, the moment we are talking about something like education, we built silos over a period of time. So there are some bits which are union government, there are some bits which are state government, but education is really a continuum. It is not really a silo. I cannot break up school education, de-link it from vocational education and de-link it from higher education. It has to be a seamless flow. It's only now that gradually the ingredients are falling into place. But yes, we have to resolve this pretty fast. I should also quickly add that there is also a spatial or geographical problem with this, because the demand for jobs is in certain parts. So you'll find parts of India where people say, I can't find people. There are parts where people are fighting amongst themselves for a few measly government jobs. So that matching part, which historically, I'm talking about the lower levels, which is historically used to be done by informal contractors, that also needs to be formalized, and we need to have a better intermediation process.
A statistic which you mentioned, you've quoted the ILO, they've projected that India will face a 29 million skill deficit by 2030. Now that is very, very significant. If we are to take advantage of the bulge that we referred to, this demographic dividend, how do we need to address this? I mean, you've spoken in broad terms. You've said that, look, companies, etc., the private sector need to be involved. But beyond that, where is the great idea? What is the
skills? No, I don't think there is a great idea, because skills are at different levels. There is a skill that's pretty low down the ladder. For example, in construction, let us say, and there are highly skilled jobs. So far as the real upper end is concerned, we must recognize that manufacturing is much more capital intensive today. So that kind of skill, or skill that is in the high end of IT, is a completely different thing from what I'm going to do if I'm going to be trained as a mason. Now much of the training, and the training does happen, much of the training is informal, which is why you will find that all the plumbers tend to be from a certain part of the country, not only from a state but from a specific part, because that informal network of skills has happened. Now that needs to be upscaled.
Let me ask you a question which might provoke you, perhaps which would be interesting. The Chinese government spokesperson, when asked about India becoming the most populous nation in the world, said, and I quote, "When assessing a country's demographic dividend, we need to look at not just the size but also the quality of its population. Size matters, but what matters more is talent resource." Do we lack quality in India?
The simple answer would be, it's going around in circles. We lack in quality, but I'm not going to react to what a Chinese government spokesperson said, except to quote back Mao Zedong, who had once said that when you think of population in China, I see, at that time, I see a billion mouths. But people see a billion mouths, but I see 2 billion hands. So population can also be a productive asset, provided, as you said, I have access to education / skills, and I have access to health also. Empirical studies show that productivity growth, incremental GDP growth in East Asia, because of the demographic transition, added about 2.5 percentage points to GDP growth. Tentative empirical estimations in India suggest it's not been 2.5%, it's been of the order of 1.5% or thereabouts. So therefore I cannot completely buy the issue of quality, and China of course has had very coercive policies on population control. I'd hate to be
and they're in trouble now.
And they're in trouble. I'd hate to be in a country where there were coercive policies, because population, or slowing down of population, is part of development. Any coercion, it distorts the population pyramid.
So they've got a counter to that argument, where they say that, look, in as much as you say that we've got a larger, older aged population, which is factually correct, their labor force participation is significantly higher than India. It's at 68% according to their statistics, and they say our labor force participation is 46%. Does this statistic count in countering the argument that that they don't have a younger workforce?
Look, when you have a problem with a workforce, different countries do different things. Immigration is obviously one. Extending the retirement age is another. China has been trying to extend the retirement age. But essentially what this means is that wages tend to get an upper push, higher. The wages tend to become higher because we have this labor crunch. And one of the problems that China has faced, it's faced several problems. One of the problems it has faced is high wages, which is why A lot of investments are relocating, partly triggered by COVID, but even before COVID are relocating elsewhere where wages are lower, and all said and done, wages, even corrected for productivity, depends on the segment we are talking about, are lower in India, which is why you will see that after a very, very long time, India is becoming part, or starting to become part of the global supply chain in manufacturing.
Which is such a key point, isn't it? Partly because of their coercive practices, some business, for example, is coming to India. Apple has recently come over here. They want to generate potentially lakhs of jobs in our country. Do you believe that as our economy grows, as more opportunities in manufacturing come up in India, particularly in the tech manufacturing space, a lot of the jobs which have been in China will come to India first before they go, for example, to Vietnam?
There are investments which exist in China today. The question of those investments relocating is, I think, a more complicated one. Instead, what one is talking about is the incremental investments. The incremental investments not happening in China, but happening in Vietnam, Philippines, Bangladesh, wherever, and in India.
Yes.
Now, so far as those incremental investments are concerned, you mentioned mobile phones. Mobile phones is the most obvious one, and mobile phones is one instance where the investments might have gone elsewhere, but have now come to India instead of going to other countries in East Asia, which I need not name. This has partly to do with the PLI scheme, but the PLI scheme has not been around for long enough. But what we have seen for mobiles should begin to happen for food processing. It should begin to happen for pharmaceuticals. There is a long list of sectors.
Right. I just one question, since we are talking about mobiles. Mobiles are so important in terms of the digital transition of India and the digital transformation of India. We've invested a great deal in this. We've got infrastructure which has come up at relatively low costs. It's something which has reached out across our country. Our 5G speeds are now very positive. It's getting even faster. We are already talking about 6G. But there is still a digital divide in this country that exists between those who can afford a smartphone and those who can't, and those who can use a smartphone and those who can't. We have invested in a particular direction, which is brilliant. I mean there's so many. But the digital divide, is that significant in your mind?
No, not to the extent that you're making out to be. I have 3 or 4 quick reactions. The first reaction is, one of the great successes in India has been the digital public infrastructure, which is not simply Aadhaar, but a whole lot of things that go with it, including UPI and DigiLocker and all of that stuff. The second point, and I'm mentioning this is because it's sometimes not realized, that if you look at production and exports of mobiles in India, earlier 20% used to be high-end and 80% used to be low value. Today, it's just turned the other way around. 80% is high-end, 20% is low value. Smartphones are much more ubiquitous than we think they are. Many people who you'd say are less advantaged in urban areas probably have smarter phones than you and I do, and they are smarter at using UPI and Paytm than we are inclined to do, because they don't use credit cards and whatever. The entire money order business has been wiped out. Where I think the digital divide exists, it's not just in terms of the levels of income, it probably still exists somewhat in the rural-urban sense. Rural-urban sense, particularly when we have not been able to ensure that there is electricity not just in every village but in every household. To give one example of this, 2 anecdotes if we have time, and both anecdotes to me were very surprising. One anecdote is from UP, and this is about 5 years ago, pre-COVID. So someone told me, hey, look, one of the servants told me that in the village, they watch films. I said, films or what? I said, smartphones. Now that village has got electricity. That time it didn't. I said, what do you mean? You have an electricity problem. He said, no, there's an entire market. Someone collects all the mobile phones from the village, takes them to the nearest town, gets them charged, gets it loaded with the... Right. Second anecdote is from Bihar. Someone told me, oh, you realize that kidnapping has come down. So I said, really? Because of Nitish Kumar? I said, no. Earlier people used to be bored and they used to go and indulge in some kidnapping. Either now they watch the latest film on the mobile, so they're no longer bored. So to the extent that boredom was responsible for minor kidnappings. Now these are the kinds of things that happen in India, which no matter how many edits commentators write, they will never be able to appreciate. So I buy the digital divide, but not as much as one would tend to think, because digital divide will be measured access to a computer. It's one of the questions that's asked in NSS. Access to a computer is becoming somewhat irrelevant for many
because
things.
your mobile replaces the
access
computer.
To a landline, for God's sake.
It's
access
gone.
to, why am I asking those questions?
Yeah. And so let's wrap up this discussion with, in a sense, with what we're talking about, the benefits of our demographic dividend. Ultimately, skilling, employment, GDP growth, all has to achieve what we aspire it to achieve. So this government wants $5 trillion in terms of the size of the economy by 2025. We are at $3.5 trillion at this stage. So how do you assess where we are as opposed to what we aspire to be?
You see, that 5 trillion is a dollar figure. And it's a nominal dollar figure, so it depends on what assumptions you make about exchange rates, what assumption you make about inflation, and the real growth rate. And the 25-26 was sort of pre-COVID.
Right.
Post-COVID, IMF, the chief economic advisor, both of them have said that it has been pushed back by about 2 years. So
2027,
28.
And you believe we'll be at 5 trillion by then? In terms of the size of the economy?
It depends on what you assume to be the real rate of growth. I just stated what the IMF had said and what the chief economic advisor has said. Even if we miss it by 27-28, I think we'll get there by about 28-29. So it's, instead of 2 years, it will become 3 years, because sometimes the human mind is incapable of fathoming the exponential nature of growth. The growth just tends to explode. So yes, also connected with this, because this is Amrit Kal, we are talking about the template for the next 25 years. Even with conservative rates of growth, we should get to a per capita income of about $10,000 in today's dollars in 2047.
By 2047,
25 years I said, which will mean India will move into the upper middle income status. So now sometimes this does things to the state of society, to the nature of the economy, which is impossible to anticipate in advance. If you cast your mind back 20 years, many of the changes that have happened would not have happened.
Yeah.
And in terms of the size of the economy, will probably be at something close to 20 trillion. So
by 2047.
By 2047, which will be pretty large.
All right. Well, it's difficult to comprehend at this stage, but it is an optimistic number, and I think it's one that can be achieved, but we have to go through various steps, and I think we've discussed that. Thank you very much, sir, for speaking to us. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Indeed. So there you have it, Dr. Bibek Debroy, telling us a little bit about where we stand economically at this stage, the benefits of our demographic dividend, but also a lot of the challenges ahead. And I think no one is averse to recognizing that we've got these challenges and we must meet them. Skilling and job creation, so very important.